Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's a wonderful Friday morning, so thank you to all the diehards that are still showing up and trooping it out. Welcome to our session today. We're going to save you millions of clicks. We're going to show you how to easily migrate complex schemas from SQL to Salesforce. I'm Mark Masterson. I'm a Salesforce developer at Robots and Pencils, and this is my colleague Dan, who I'm sure many of you know. And he's the Salesforce practice lead at Robots and Pencils. We're a consulting company, and we're relatively new. Do you want to go into a little about what we do?
Sure. Yeah, we have some time, so no rush on this session. It's Robots and Pencils. Interesting name. We bring together the robots side of the house, which are like the software engineers, with the pencils, which are like designers, creatives, user experience type folks. So our vision is, arts and sciences coming together to create these wonderful new experiences. And all the usual stuff, we're looking for work, we're hiring, all that kind of stuff. And we've got some nice swag here on the front of the stage for the end of our talk.
Everyone's favorite slide that I'm sure you've seen a bajillion times already is the forward-looking statement. So obviously don't make any purchasing decisions on future forward-looking things. We're not doing any of that today, but it's got to be in there. I'm sure you've seen it many times. So the inspiration for this entire talk is a project we did for a company called Level Capital, which is a construction lending company. They had an application built in MS Access and SQL Server, and it had over 75 tables, 800 fields, and they wanted to move that all into the cloud in a more modern infrastructure. And we actually have Leah from Level Capital here. If you want to raise your hand. So thank you for helping us do this. So we built this to migrate that schema to Salesforce, but we genericized it so that anyone can do it. So go on to the next slide. So you know the story. You have things in SQL, and you want to move this all over to Salesforce. Who has had to do a project like this before? And that's probably why you came today. Obviously, this is especially important if you want to do the customer wants to do a data migration, because you need a landing place for that data to go. So you need the objects in Salesforce in order to migrate them. And there's a variety of things you need from SQL to go into Salesforce. You need the tables, and those become S objects typically. You have all the fields, and then you need all the interconnected relationships between those. And obviously, this can get to be a lot of clicking in Salesforce. To create the data model with clicks in Salesforce, you have to go to setup, everyone's favorite area. You have to create new object. You have to fill in all the info, decide what kind of, if you want to have the search enabled, all that stuff, and then you have to go in and click new field, you have to select the data type, you have to fill in all the info for those. It's a lot of clicking. So it can just get to be a lot. So we were kind of looking at how many you do when you're going through that flow. It's about 7 clicks per object. So you do that times the number of objects, and then it's about 7 clicks per field times the number of fields. And then it's just a lot of typing, because you have to type in all the field names and the API. You don't have to typically fill in the API name, but all the field labels and everything. So it's a lot. If we go with the previous numbers, 75 objects and 800 fields, it isn't a million clicks. It's like over 6,000. But if you times that times the number of projects, we're looking to save you a million clicks for real. Another option, and I don't know how many people have utilized this at all. Has anyone utilized to create objects from spreadsheet? It came out in summer 19. It's pretty cool. You don't have to go through all the navigation. You just set up a spreadsheet, and then you can import that into Salesforce. So it's pretty cool, but you still have to set up the spreadsheet. And then you still have to go through, make sure it's importing correctly, make sure your types are correct. One of the very cool things is that about this is that you can actually have this checkbox here. I don't know if everyone can see it, the add to layouts. So that will automatically add it to your page layout. That's a really cool part of this feature. So that kind of gets through where you're going through the navigation and you automatically set it up into page layouts. That's kind of how this does that. It's pretty cool, but you still have to set up, you still have to click in the spreadsheet, you still have to set everything up. We're gonna try to automate all of that for you. So how can we automate? There's a number of high-level steps we have to do here. First, we have to query SQL for the tables, fields, and the data types. Then we use processing logic to convert that into Salesforce, the Salesforce metadata, how Salesforce likes to ingest it. And we do that by generating an intermediary CSV, and that allows you to preview what it's generated before you import it into Salesforce. That way, you're just not like automatically doing the metadata API and have a bunch of junk that you didn't want in Salesforce. And then the last step is to actually deploy to Salesforce. So, first step, queries SQL Server for metadata. The SQL Server has system tables that contain the metadata around all the tables and fields inside of it. So you generate a query to grab that metadata. So we have this query here. There's a GitHub repo that we've open sourced, and that query is in there. So you'll be able to utilize this. We haven't tested this against like Postgres or MySQL, so there might be some tweaks, but this works against like SQL Server for sure. So the goal is to query this and then export it as a CSV. That way you get a usable format of this SQL Server metadata. Then we run a transformation that transforms that metadata into the type that Salesforce likes to ingest, the XML. And then we use the Force migration toolkit to push that into Salesforce. So the benefits of that intermediary spreadsheet is that it gives you this view into what you're actually generating. There's a huge amount of benefits to this. You get a data dictionary of what you're doing. It's automated, so like you get this CSV of all the fields, but it's kind of an 80-20 rule. So like you get 80% of it generated, but there's 20% you might want to like look at and make sure, like if you're like, for instance, accounts and contacts, you want to transform the SQL Server stuff into accounts and contacts. You're not going to want to like just generate, like let's say they have a customer table in Access. You might want to transform that into accounts and contacts, so you don't want to directly create a customer's S object. So this allows you to do that kind of transformation. You can do team sign-off, you can do iterations in terms of what you want to do. You might want to not import the entire schema over as is. You might want to do some of your own data modeling on top of it. It gives you good documentation for what you've done. And then also it helps inform the data migration later. Like I said, you typically do this in order to enable a data migration. So this gives you the service mappings, basically, that will enable you to do that data migration later on. There's a number of data type differences between SQL and Salesforce. Calling out a number of them here, like SQL doesn't have pick lists. They're basically enumerated tables. So they'll just be foreign keys up to like a types table is typically the way you do that. So that's one thing you'll have to like look at is make sure that if something you want to become a pick list, you'll have to transform that table into a pick list instead of just making another object. Then there's checkboxes. SQL doesn't have checkboxes. They're usually represented as bits, so you have a 0 or a 1, which is true or false, or we've also seen tiny ints, and that can get kind of goofy. There can be like, people will use -1 and 0. And then also, SQL has money and Salesforce has currency. There's a number of other differences. We have a file that kind of maps these default, but it's not always what you want, so that's another benefit of generating that CSV where you can double check that the types are what you want them to be. There's a number of metadata that is missing in SQL. It doesn't have field labels, it doesn't have plural names, and it obviously doesn't have any knowledge of whether something's a master detail or a lookup like how we have in Salesforce. It just has foreign keys. So that's another part of the step. We automatically generate the field labels and plural names, but it's something you'll want to double check because it's an automated script and it might not turn out the way you want it to be. And then if something is actually a master detail, you'll have to specify that versus like a lookup. There's also a number of, I just wanted to go over like SQL versus SQL naming conventions. SQL allows you to do aliasing everywhere, pretty much. Salesforce, you can only do aliasing in aggregate queries. So here you can see we have like dbo.account.name as account name, and then you can use that later in the query. And then with Salesforce and SQL, you just do account.name, the field, and then if you want to do like relationship queries, stuff like that, that's different. And then SQL, you can actually do joins within your queries, whereas Salesforce, you either do parent queries or you can do subqueries. And then another thing I just wanted to call out before, I think the next slide is handing it over to Dan. Yes, it is. The other thing I wanted to call out is that one thing that is very hard to capture that you don't get in that SQL Server metadata is temp tables. That's just really hard to capture, so that's just something you have to do as an analysis step is look through the queries that are generating temp tables, and typically that has to become like triggers or something like that. You'll have to do some programmatic logic to take care of things that are doing temp tables. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dan for the demo.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, so for our demo, we're actually going to do this for you live here, so we're praying to the demo gods as always. Is anyone familiar with the Northwind demo database from Microsoft? So we're using that one. It's a classic. It's pretty cool, a couple reasons. So number one, it's well, let's try to pretend it's a real company here. So we got their logo up there. They're a fictitious specialty foods export-import company. So just imagine what they might need. Like they might have things like their products in there, their sales data, things like that. So this is an ERD there that represents the Northwind database, typical thing you'll see on like a lot of Microsoft projects. It's maybe a little hard to see, but that's kind of a good approximation of the complexity of the database we're going to move. It's not as big as the one that we did for Level Capital, but you probably wouldn't want to have to click through and type 7 times 7 for like each little piece of that. So this is the example we're going to use. All right, so first step, let's take a look at the SQL database. So you can see over here, Northwind, it's got these tables. The query Mark was talking about earlier basically just runs through all these tables and looks at all the fields and all the data types, in char, that kind of thing. So this queries all of this metadata. And what it does is it produces a nice, sort of CSV flat file that's normalized and easy to work with. So some of the key fields it produces for us are the table name, the field name, and then it does this data type, which we use to translate into the Salesforce data type. Also, one thing to note, one of the reasons I like the Northwind database, it's got a mix of good and bad practices in it. As you can see, some of these tables are like pluralized and some are singular. It's kind of all over the map. So it's a good example of what you might see in the real world. People don't follow conventions, that sort of thing. And our project we've called Robo Schema that we're open sourcing today will actually normalize these for you. They'll make, Salesforce will have all the table names singular, all the plural names plural, and it even, thanks to a package that we found, it even handles like the IES kind of stuff, the strange pluralizations. So yeah, first step, look at your SQL database, basically just paste in the SQL query, run it, take this, grab it, copy it. Now you have the CSV. And then you'll want to clone our repo, robo-schema, and you'll want to paste it into a CSV here. We call it input.csv. So it's the exact same thing we just looked at over on the SQL server, but it's sitting here locally. And you don't need to do anything with it at this point. This is just an input file. We're not going to edit this file or anything. We just drop it in as is. So the next step, you can see we have two scripts. We have robo-schema1 and robo-schema2. And this kind of gives us that intermediary capability. We're not just going to generate it and create the metadata, deploy to Salesforce in one step. We're going to do the first step, look at it, and then deploy it if we like it. So robo-schema1, we can take a quick look at this to see what it does. It reads in that input CSV, and it's looking at all of the data in there and doing some transformations. So I wanted to point out a couple. One is like a camel to spaces function that we have that will take camel case SQL Server names and break them, like put a space at all the camel cases. So it makes it look like a nice label in Salesforce that you can read. And then also, you know, this singular and plural. This is thanks to this pluralize NPM package. Works really well to go both directions. So essentially, we're just doing a light transformation with this. We've got a map of the SQL data types to the Salesforce data types, but it's not as simple as a straight mapping. So there's a little bit of conditional stuff in here. For example, there's no max for a length in Salesforce. So we take maxes and make them 255 in this case. We take currency and set them to 2 decimal places. This will work for, works for the Northwind database. But the problem is there's infinite different ways that people could have set up the SQL database in terms of the standards they followed. So you may have to edit some of this logic here depending on what people have done. We just can't account for all the different ways people have built SQL databases over the years, but this is a good starting point. So we can go ahead and run this. And if you look here, there's a transform.csv. I'm going to delete it. And then I'm going to run it. Oh. Sorry, it's a little small here. Okay, I'm sorry, I forgot a step. Clone the repo and then npm install. We didn't put all those npm packages in the repo. We just have the package.json that points out to them. You can see it just created the node modules. And then we'll go ahead and run it. And it creates the transformed CSV. So this is the one Mark was talking about. That's your intermediary spreadsheet you can take a look at. This actually has both. This has the original data and the transformed data, so we can do nice comparison here. So just a couple things to highlight, right? All we had in SQL Server was a table name. We've created a Salesforce API name. We went from plural to singular. We've also got the singular label, the plural label. It was smart enough to, do singular here, plural here. Column name, field name. Basically, for field name, we're just tacking on a $_C. But for field label, that's where that camel to spaces came in. So you can see all SQL gave us was like category name, but we were able to break it into category name. It's also converted these data types for us. So these maybe are starting to look more familiar to you. Text 255, Salesforce date time, things like this. And so this, this can be used for data dictionary, it can be used for data migration, that kind of stuff. So you run this up the flagpole at your company. Everybody says, yeah, this looks like a great new schema. Throw it into Salesforce for us. So the next step is I have a sort of like a cooking show. I have one that's already been baked in the oven. I'm going to highlight a couple things in this one. It's almost the same file, but in this case, so when you're talking about migrating relationships to Salesforce, many times there's not enough information in the schema to determine the relationships. It's arbitrary joins on primary and foreign keys. So a person has to look at these things and determine, sometimes the names don't even map up. They might call, something ID and customer ID, and you don't know what's what. So that might be a small analysis step when we talk about the 80-20. And also there could be things like self-referentials and multiple references to the same object for like different contexts. So essentially that's one little piece you have to do after you transform this. You have to add in your lookups or master details. And you can kind of, as you scroll through this, you can see there's some pieces missing. These are the relationship fields that we've added. So I'll just highlight this one. Essentially, it's very similar to the way we did the other data types, but in this case, these are blank because it didn't come from SQL, right? It came from our head. And these over here are similar field name, label, but now you see lookup data type, reference to, relationship name, relationship label. So that's like when you're running a query, this would be like your child relationship you would query, and this is what you'd see in your related list. So we've got all the fields moved over. Relationships were a little extra step we had to do because that took some little bit of thought. If you had a really good database where they define the primary foreign key relationships, we could automate that. But actually we've seen it more often than not, they don't have that. It just depends kind of what industry you're in. Okay, so this one actually has the relationship. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna like delete this one and rename this one. Okay, now we come over to our Salesforce org. So this was a fresh developer org that I created this morning. I got the security token for it, and you can see here's schema builder filtered to standard objects, custom objects, sorry. No custom objects in this org. So what we want to do is move that Northwind database that was living in SQL Server that I showed you in here, and we can like see all the objects here. So to get that point, we have to run the next step, which is roboschema2. So we need to take that transform spreadsheet and transform it yet again into XML in the Salesforce metadata format. We'll take a look at what that looks like. You can see it just created this source folder. Inside it, we've got a folder called objects with all those Northwind objects. We've also got a package.xml, so we can take a look at both of these really quick. Package.xml is just all the fully qualified fields with the objects down at the bottom. And the object metadata, it's got some defaults that you might need, typical defaults you probably don't change very often in Salesforce, but you might go back and adjust these afterwards. But then it's got all those fields, right? Full name, label, text, length, this kind of stuff. So there's all our fields. And the final step is to deploy this into the org. So we're just using sort of plain Jane Force.com migration tool, build.xml, build.properties. Maybe you've worked with this before. Maybe a future version could use Salesforce DX, but this is a one-time thing, so we don't want to over-engineer it either. You generally will just do this once as part of your development. So, quickly just highlight, we just have this, we call it robo deploy that just does a deploy of that metadata that we saw. So you would just go ant deploy, and it's probably going to go too fast for me to even watch the deployment, so I won't even bother. We can just watch it here. Uh-oh. Live demo bug. So I ran this morning and it worked. I'm not sure what's different. It looks like it's not liking one of the relationships. My apologies. I think what I'm going to do is open that transform spreadsheet really quick. And maybe I'll just set that one to a lookup field.
Live debugging.
quick workaround. Okay. So then we just run our robo schema 2 again and our deploy again. Success. All right. That just saved like a whole day's worth of drudgery of putting your headphones on and clicking over and over again and probably putting the wrong fields on the wrong object. So let's refresh. And we're going to go custom, select all, auto layout, and maybe we'll do like a zoom out. So there's the Northwind database in Salesforce ready to have your data migrated into it. So I have a little code to show you in terms of how we created the XML to do this also, but we have plenty of time. This session's nicely paced. Does anybody have any questions? Anything you want me to clarify? The URL? Yeah, definitely. I was going to tweet it out at the end of the session. Do you use Twitter? No. It'll be on the slides too. You can take a picture of it. Okay.
It's on one of the last slides.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Okay. Was there another one over here? Yeah. Yeah, so the question was, what are the profile, permission access, that kind of thing. So this doesn't handle that, but that would be a great enhancement because, as you know, that can be very painful. And with custom objects, you need to grant access to every field also. What I use for this sometimes is like the check all plugin for Chrome, and I'll go into a profile permission set and just have it check everything. But yeah, I would love to add that on. So not only produce the object metadata, but maybe a profile permission set. But currently it doesn't do that. That's a follow-on step. Also the page layouts, this gets you, this does the heavy lifting, but there's still plenty of work to do after that. Okay. Yeah, we didn't show this in this demo. So part of this process was taking a really advanced customer implementation and dumbing it down for the demo. So we weren't showing customer data and a lot of IP and stuff like that. In our other implementation that's not open source, we did have some conversion for that. We used more sets of spreadsheets to map the lookup tables from SQL Server into global value sets and pick lists for Salesforce. That's declarative. And we may, if we have time, we may have time to genericize that and move it into this project in the future. Cool. Okay, so I just wanted to point out some of the code about the XML transformation for any of the developers in the room. I think this is this session is very relevant for admins and developers. I could see potentially an admin and developer working together on this. The admin might work on the spreadsheet and the developer might maintain this stuff and deploy it. So this is more of the developer stuff. How do we take that spreadsheet and make XML from it? So we kind of have these templates here, and we're basically doing, you could think of it almost like in Salesforce you would do an email merge. It's a similar kind of a thing where we're merging in the plural label, we're merging in the singular label, we're merging in all the XML fields. So this code runs through the spreadsheet and generates this XML. But the thing about, CSV is kind of a structured data, sort of. It's, columns that all line up, but XML is unstructured. One element might have 5 and the other one might have 10. So the way we handled that was we kind of made like a base definition for a field. These are the properties of the XML that basically any field is going to have. And then conditionally, depending on the data type, we'll add in some extras, right? So if it's a text field, you're not going to have precision and scale, but if it's currency or number, you will. That kind of a thing. So it's sort of a base field definition with an extended dynamic definition depending on which type it is, and it pulls that from the spreadsheet. that's about it for my demo. Happy to answer any specific questions, or if not, we can finish a little early. I do want to show you the slides, but before I do that, any questions? Okay, so the important stuff, right? Just do a quick recap here. Mark mentioned this, I showed you in the demo, but just very briefly, we got the metadata from that source database, we converted it, maybe you did some internal processes to sign off on it, review, iterate, and then deployed it into the Salesforce org. And there's the URL, RoboSchema. All right, so the cool thing about this project was there was a lot of relevant trails or modules on Trailhead. The data modeling one, that's pretty important for this. Mark was touching on some of that data modeling concepts. You might run into like bad data models in SQL, so you should know how can you improve them before bringing them into Salesforce. Customizing a Salesforce object, right? That's like the approximately 7 clicks, how do you go through and configure a field, that kind of stuff. Building a data model for a recruiting app, that's a good hands-on exercise to build a real-life data model. Our scripts were done in Node.js and JavaScript, so if you need to maintain them, thankfully there's 3 modules on JavaScript in Trailhead, so that JavaScript is one of the #1 languages Salesforce developers should be familiar with these days, both for the back end, the Node.js scripts, things like that, but also for Lightning Web Components. So thankfully Trailhead has these JavaScript modules. And that's all we have. So thank you, everybody. Come on up.
Thank you.
Say hi, get some swag.